Okay, today we are doing section 4.6. Our goal is we are going to be using the quadratic formula to solve. Remember, solve means find the zeros, find the roots, find the x-intercepts, find the solutions. Okay, the quadratic formula. Quadratic formula looks like this. It is the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, the whole thing divided by 2a. Now, this is going to be an order of operations problem. You're going to have to get an answer to everything under the square root sign before you take the square root, and then you're going to have to get an answer for the whole top before you divide it by 2 times a. So let's work through our first example. X squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. Your directions would be to solve. A is your coefficient on your x squared, which is 1. B is your coefficient on x, which is 5. C is your constant, which is 6. So we're going to do the opposite of b. B was 5, so it's going to be negative 5, plus or minus, which just means in the end we're going to be doing 2 problems. The square root of b squared, so 5 squared, minus 4 times 1 times 6, the whole thing divided by 2 times 1. Okay, so in doing what's under the square root sign, it's going to be the opposite of b, negative 5, plus or minus 5 squared is 25. The 4 times 1 times 6 gives us 24, so it's 25 minus 24 all over 2 times 1, which is 2. So we've got the opposite of 5, plus or minus, it was 25 minus 24, which is 1, so it's negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 1 all over 2. Now, this is where you're going to break it into 2 problems. The square root of 1 is 1, so it becomes negative 5 plus 1 divided by 2. Negative 5 plus 1 is negative 4 divided by 2, which gives you negative 2. And the other problem is negative 5 minus 1, all divided by 2. So negative 5 minus 1 is negative 6 divided by 2. So that is negative 3. So our 2 solutions, or our 2 x-intercepts, would be at negative 2 and negative 3. Okay, the next examples I have for you. There are going to be 2 rational roots. Rational roots means there's going to be 2 x-intercepts. So our problem starts out as x squared minus 10x equals 11. I put the 11 in red so that you can see that it's on the other side of the equal sign. We would have to subtract 11 from both sides. So our problem becomes x squared minus 10x minus 11 equals 0. Our a term is 1. Our b term is negative 10. Our c term is negative 11. So we're going to do the opposite of b, 10, plus or minus the square root of this whole thing. My square root sign should go out a little farther. Negative 10 squared. Remember, if you're going to use a calculator there, you have to use the parentheses or it will lie to you. It will give you a negative answer when it should be positive. Negative 10 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 11, all divided by 2 times 1. So 4 times 1 times negative 11 gives me negative 44. So it's 10 plus or minus the square root of 100 minus a negative 44 all over 2. 100 minus negative 44 is 144. So we have 10 plus or minus the square root of 100 over 2. The square root of 144 is 12. So our problem becomes 10 plus or minus 12 over 2, which is where we break it into 2 problems. 10 plus 12, which is 22, divided by 2, which is 11. 10 minus 12, which is negative 2, divided by 2 is negative 1. So we had 2 rational roots, means they're nice numbers. Their numbers would be like on our number line. Our 2 x-intercepts would be 11 and negative 1 for that problem. Okay, you can check your answers by plugging your solution back into the problem, and both parts should make it true. So we said one of our solutions was 11. We can do 11 squared minus 10 times 11 minus 11 should give me a 0. 121 minus 111 gives me 11. Minus 11 gives me 0. That one checks. And we can take our other solution, negative 1 squared minus 10 times negative 1 minus 11 equals 0. Negative 1 squared is 1. Negative 10 times negative 1 is 10. So we've got 1 plus 10, which is 11, minus 11 is 0. Okay? So then I've given you a practice problem. Starts out x squared plus 6x equals 16. So if you want to hit pause now and do this problem, I'll give you a second to get it written down. Remember, we got to move the 16 over to the other side by subtracting 16 from both sides. You get x squared plus 6x minus 16 equals 0. A equals 1 because it's our coefficient on x squared. B is 6 because it's a coefficient on x. And C is negative 16. So we have the opposite of B, plus or minus the square root of b squared, 6 squared, minus 4 times our a value, 1, times our c value, negative 16, all divided by 2 times 1. So 36, 6 squared is 36. 4 times 1 times negative 16 is negative 64. So we have negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 36 minus a negative 64, all divided by 2. And 36 minus a negative 64, when we change to add off, will give me 100. So I have negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 100 all over 2. That's going to be the square root of 100 is 10. So it's negative 6 plus 10, which will give me 4. Got to do everything on top before you divide it by the denominator. So 4 divided by 2 gives you an answer of 2. And negative 6 minus 10 will give you negative 16 divided by 2 will give you an answer of negative 8. Okay? Next problem. Sometimes there's only one real root. Remember, roots are your x-intercepts. If your problem is x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 0, we know a is 1 because it's our coefficient on x squared. B is 8, it's our coefficient on x. C is 16, it's our constant. We're going to do the opposite of b, negative 8, plus or minus b squared, 8 squared, minus 4 times our a value, which is 1, times our c value, which is 16, all divided by 2 times our a, 2 times 1. Remember, you've got to do what's under your square root sign first. So we have negative 8 plus or minus 8 squared was 64. 4 times 1 times 16 is also 64. So you have 64 minus 64, which gives you negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 2. Square root of 0 is 0, so you only have one answer this time, negative 8 divided by 2. So sometimes there's only going to be one x-intercept. Sometimes there's 2, sometimes there's 1, sometimes there's none. Okay? Next problem. Bear with me as I pull up my bulletin boards. This time we have two irrational roots. Remember, irrational numbers are numbers that are not nice numbers. They cannot be written as a ratio. They don't end. They don't repeat. So if I have a problem that is 2x squared plus 6x minus 7 equals 0, you always want to tell me your a, b, and c for every problem before you start. A would be 2 because it's your number of x squareds. B would be 6 because it's the number in front of x. Your constant is negative 7. So our problem is the opposite of b will give us negative 6 plus or minus b squared, 6 squared, minus 4, which is times a, times c, all over 2 times a. So 6 squared gives me 36. Then we have minus. When I take 4 times 2, I get 8, times 7, I get negative 56. So it's going to be minus a negative 56, which is the same thing as plus 56, all divided by 4. And if we slide up over here, that gives us negative 6 plus or minus. When we added our 36 and our 56 together, we get 92, all over 4. We know that we can't keep a perfect square factor under the square root sign. 92 breaks down into the square root of 4 times the square root of 23. So we have negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 4, which is 2 times the square root of 23. So you can leave it as negative 6 plus or minus 2 square root of 23 over 4. Or you can simplify this fraction by doing negative 6 over 4, which simplifies to 3/2. 2 over 4 simplifies to 1/2. So you can leave it as negative 3/2 plus or minus 1 radical 23 over 2. That whole thing should be over 2 there. That fraction bar should actually extend out. Or you could have left it like this, negative 3 plus or minus 1 square root of 23 over 2. Those are two irrational roots. There are still two roots, but they are not nice numbers. Okay, the last one is we're going to have two complex roots, which when we have complex roots, remember we said there was a real part and an imaginary part, which means there's going to be no x-intercepts. If you were to graph these, they're either going to open up like this above the x-axis, or it's going to open down like this below the x-axis. So when you have complex numbers, you're going to have no x-intercepts. So let's do a problem like that. Your problem starts out as x squared minus 6x equals negative 10. We're going to add 10 to both sides to get everything on one side. So you've got x squared minus 6x plus 10 equals 0. Your a is your number of x squareds. It's 1. Your b is negative 6. I think I goofed on this problem. Let's fix this as we go. Probably going to change our answers a little bit. Okay, this should have been a negative 6, which means this is going to be the opposite of that. It's going to be a positive 6. I'll change my answers here just a little bit. So let's go back through this. A is 1, B is negative 6, C is 10. So the opposite of B will give us positive 6. See, even Mrs. Deutsch makes mistakes. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, which should be negative 6 squared. But in the parenthesis, when we square negative 6, that's going to give us the positive 36 minus 4 times 1 times 10. 4 times 1 times 10 will give me 40. So I've got 36 minus 40. So it's negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 4. So we've got positive 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 all over 2. And we've got that negative 4 under a square root, which if you were thinking about the assignment that you just completed, we can't leave negatives under the square root sign. So we're making that right now look like negative 1 times the square root of 4. We know that negative 1 is the same thing as I squared. So it's 6 plus or minus the square root of I squared, which is the same thing as our negative 1, times our square root of 4 all over 2. The square root of I squared is I. The square root of 4 is 2. So our problem becomes 6 plus or minus 2i over 2. When you simplify that, you could write it as 6 over 2 plus or minus 2i over 2. 6 divided by 2 gives me positive 3. So it would be positive 3, 2i divided by 2 gives me plain old I. So my answer would be 3 plus or minus I. Okay. There is more to this section 4-6 with just the discriminant. We will come back and do more of that on Monday. I will post the problems that you're going to do in the agenda. Hope this helps. Give me a call if you need any help. Missing your smiling faces. Wish we were doing this face to face. Talk soon. Bye.